Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's me, Diana Perry Cruz.
And it's me, your lovable pal, Jackie.
I thought we were going to just confuse everyone.
Well, I realize that's why people sometimes email us to say which one of you is actually married to Rob, because we never say our last names.
Oh.
So I thought that might be helpful.
They can't just like see our smoldering eye contact.
I don't know if it really
through
comes
the airwaves
in the way that we think it does.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. It's very obvious to me. I don't know. I don't know what's up with our listeners. But this isn't a podcast about how to make sure people know who your spouse is and is not. This is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic relevant to our field and discuss some fabulous research articles. And sometimes we're very fortunate because we get guests. Sometimes those guests have even written the articles usually they've told us to read them, so it helps us out even more. But the articles that we've read and will be about to discuss. And today is one of those times. One of these times I'm going to do that intro, and we don't have a guest, just letting you know. You could have listened to a different episode. Today we do have a guest, because we're going to be talking all about the topic of behavioral instruction, specifically behavioral instruction for you fancy college and university folks out there. And to bring in some background information and some recent research on the topic and the use of behavioral instruction, we have a very special guest, Dr. Kendra Guinness. Kendra, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hi, Rob. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Kendra is an extra special guest, you can tell, because she got to listen to us talk about boring network and podcasting related garbage before starting the show. So, she's really excited, I'm sure, to be here now.
Riveting stuff.
Behind the scenes. So, Kendra, today we're talking about behavioral instruction, which encompasses a lot. So, please, I think we started, you sent us a really great kind of a nice primer sort of to go over like all the things we could talk about. And then we'll sort of, maybe after the break, we'll sort of, cut it down and focus specifically sort of on the area where you've been researching, because there's a lot there. And we will, got like a little over an hour to talk about it. So we're not going to cover it all, folks. I'm sorry. If you were hoping, you see the title, you're like, I'll learn all I need in this hour podcast, I'm sure. But before we get into behavioral instruction and all that good stuff, Kendra, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to want to talk about this topic?
Sure, absolutely. So, my name is Kendra Guinness. I received my master's degree in behavior analysis from, this little school. I don't know if you've heard of it, Regis College. I also received my doctorate in behavior analysis from Simmons University. Currently, I'm a visiting lecturer at Regis College and also an associate scientist at the Oregon Research Institute. So I found my way into this field, like I think a lot of other people, through an initial interest in working with children with autism. But during my master's degree and later my PhD, I found what I was really interested in is the teaching of skills to typically developing adult learners. So whether that's caregivers, behavior therapists, or college students. So currently I'm collaborating with some really smart colleagues at Regis College on some cool research in higher education, but also working on some projects through my role at ORI related to caregiver training.
Excellent. So, Kendra, before we go on further, we're thinking of updating the Regis ad in the middle. So could you give us like a Regis College worked for me? Or some sort of sound that we could throw in there?
Yeah.
VCR repair.
Yeah. We needed a jingle like that.
I know. We'll think if one comes up, while we're talking about the articles, feel free to just kind of throw it right in.
Bust it out.
Yeah, just cool. Saying we'll get our keyboards and everything. So behavioral instruction, I know, you've certainly written on the topic. When you were kind of thinking about what, you want to devote all your time on, was there something specifically about behavioral instruction that grabbed you?
Sure. So I kind of found my way here by accident as I was finished up my master's degree, working clinically. I was also teaching as an adjunct at Regis. I knew I still wanted to be involved in research. And at the time I was teaching an intro to psychology class for undergraduates. And something that I noticed is that my students had a really tough time with APA formatting. And so I started thinking about how can I help my students do this? And I found myself kind of thinking back to my coursework, and I remember hearing some things about like something called PSI or PI, so programmed instruction, personalized system of instruction. And I started kind of looking into that, and that's how I first started kind of getting into this type of research. And so designing a system of behavioral instruction using course management software like Moodle, and creating a program that students could do on the computer at their own pace, but still have a lot of opportunities for responding and feedback and all that good stuff. And through that is kind of how I found my way to Simmons University and working with Dr. Philip Chase, who has a lot of experience in this area. And that's part of the reason why I was excited to talk about this chapter written by Bernstein and Chase, really kind of bringing together these different forms of behavioral instruction. Because I know through my own research, and definitely if someone can find an article that is like this, that would be awesome. Because I have yet to find an article saying like programmed instruction versus PSI. Mm-hmm. Here are the similarities and differences, right. Or here are the common elements. I think part of that reason might be they were developed around the same time. So Skinner developed programmed instruction at Harvard. And then around the same time, Fred Keller was developing personalized system of instruction. But as I've looked through the literature, they don't really cite each other or kind of reference each other's work. Again, if someone can find that citation, please let me know. I haven't been able to find it. So thinking about how these programs do have a lot of similarities, and that's kind of where this chapter comes in, of the key components of what we can broadly call behavioral instruction.
So speaking of that chapter, and speaking of the research articles we'll be discussing, Diana, please tell us what articles we'll be talking about on this episode.
Okay, so first up, we have the chapter that Kendra is referencing. It's called Contributions of Behavior Analysis to Higher Education. That was by Bernstein and Chase, and it was published in the APA Handbook of Behavior Analysis, Volume 2, Translating Principles into Practice. Madden was the editor on that, and it was published in 2013. Next up, Effects of Behavioral Instruction and Feedback Checklists on Graphing Conventions by our very own Guinness, Chase, Turner, and Axe. That was published in the Journal of Behavioral Education, 2023.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've heard of this year.
Yes. 1, 2, 3. 23. And finally, the effects of an avoidance contingency on post-secondary student safe meds performance by Mason, Rivera, and Arriaga. And that was published in the European Journal of Behavior Analysis, 2017. Okay.
So, Kendra, why don't we start by talking about kind of behavioral instruction generally, and specifically the Chase & Co. chapter, which, I just want to say thank you so much. When you sent these out, you made a very nice note in your email. Maybe we only want to talk about the first few pages because this is a long chapter. You don't have to read it all. I thought it was a fascinating chapter because I loved the review. I loved the different sort of talking points that Chase brought into the discussion about what is valuable about behavioral instruction in higher education. What are some problems higher education faces? Questions that I didn't even know I wanted answers to were brought up and answered in that chapter. So I appreciate that you said we did not have to read it all to have a discussion on the show, but I found it very interesting. So I did read it all. I thought it was a really great chapter. And I think one of the big questions really came out of it as, what's the point of higher education? Like, what are we trying to get out of this? Because I think everyone's like, well, you go to high school, and then you go to college, then you get a good job, then you can buy a house. And I think if we've learned anything over the past few years, it's as many of these things that we assumed were sort of just what you did, at least here in America. Maybe that's not how they work. Maybe people go to college and they say, I've wasted a lot of money and I now have no marketable skills. Maybe they go to college and they say, I have amazing learning opportunities. I don't know how this turns into a job. Maybe they say, I went to college and paid a lot of money. I learned nothing and I actually tried really hard. So I guess, from your opinion and you're, looking at the field, like, what do you think the goal of college, of going to university really is?
Wow, you went really meta there.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's a big, big question. Yes. I really can only speak from personal experience when thinking about the big picture of what is college all really about. But I think it part of it might be field specific. So for instance, in behavior analysis, we learn a lot of skills in our master's programs, but it's also really important to kind of have the piece of paper. Like you need to have that degree in order to sit for the exam and get the certification. Whereas I know I was involved in theater in college, and I am still friends with some people in that realm who have a bachelor's or maybe even a master's in something like theater arts and have learned a lot of really important skills through their coursework and maybe made certain industry connections with their professors. But at least through my understanding, when you go for an audition for a role and they say, but you don't have an MFA, sorry, that wouldn't happen kind of the same way in our field. So I think kind of separating out where is it that you need the certification that you completed these degree requirements versus where are you either learning industry specific or field specific skills, but also just general kind of, and they talk about this a bit in the chapter of like critical thinking and higher order learning, thinking about undergraduates or maybe learning things like time management or how to, look up your professor's email in the syllabus and ask them a question or go to office hours or problem solve around, I need to take this course before I graduate, but it's not being offered until next fall. So kind of the three-prong approach. It's to learn some industry-specific or field-specific skills. It's to learn some general skills related to kind of functioning as an adult. But then also in some fields like our own, there's an aspect of you need that piece of paper to advance to the next stage in your career.
I think that's what makes The Bridge of Jack and Diane so poignant, is he really touches on how hard it is to grow up.
Old Lady
Hold
Rock?
on to 16 as long as you can. Changes come around real soon, make us women and men.
Yeah. Kind of going along with the topic we're talking about today, you can think about some of those like adulting skills of like writing an email professionally or, showing up on time for an interview, thinking about those as skills that can be taught. And I've seen, I know my college offered like an intro to college course where they taught things like how to make your schedule and how to read a syllabus.
That's awesome.
So especially when you think about like accessibility for maybe students with more diverse backgrounds, there are skills you need to be successful in college. And if we don't have those skills, that doesn't necessarily mean college isn't for you. It just means we need to learn those skills first.
Mm-hmm. I know I was very surprised in the chapter how because when I think of like, well, what should we learn in college? Well, I went to college to learn X. So let's say behavior analysis or psychology, whatever it is, or a field that's going to get me into behavior analysis from a master's, let's say. So I want to take the classes that, of course, teach me the most. And I think when we start talking about teaching beyond the high school level, so we're talking about, higher education, it does feel like there are more ways to approach education than, say, at an elementary level or even sort of, a senior high school level, because the focus may be on fluency in kind of specific skills. It may be on those sort of synthesis and critical thinking skills and how you apply what you've learned. And all of those could happen within various courses during your college or master's kind of career. It's not like, well, you learn all the basic skills the first year and then you apply them a little bit the second year. And it's like, no, your first year you're taking this class, the second you're taking this class, and you have to do all of the things, all of the skills within that semester. Maybe you're lucky and it's one of those 2-semester classes and you get a little bit more time, which again, then feels like, well, we should probably be using some of these behavioral instruction methodology because at least there's some research to support their utility. Though I think Chase did a good job of explaining that even though there is a lot of benefit to behavioral instruction, it's not as simple as, and they always worked, and woe is behavior analysis. Once more, we're not invited to the party because of old political reasons. There are actually some other kind of factors going into it. Kendra, before we go too much, because I know you sort of mentioned PI and PSI, would you mind just doing kind of a quick rundown of like behavioral instruction generally refers to these types of learning styles? Because again, some folks may not be in academics or they may not want to think about their higher education career at this point in their lives and would like to have someone else tell them.
Absolutely. So yeah, as I mentioned, kind of the two most common, or I guess that's the wrong phrase. We'll say, so the first type of behavioral instruction devised by Skinner and his colleagues called programmed instruction. Another type, very similar, developed around the same time, would be the personalized system of instruction, or PSI, that was developed by Fred Keller. Some other types that Chase talks about in the chapter: precision teaching. So that was mostly researched by Ogden Lindsley, has a lot of emphasis on measures of fluency and using the standard acceleration chart. One strategy that I think maybe more recently, I think a lot of people have experienced in their graduate programs is interteaching. So that was, I believe, originally described by Boyce and Heinlein. A little bit of a departure as we talk about some of the common features of behavioral instruction. Some other programs that might be considered within this realm, direct instruction is another one. I know that's a little bit outside of the field of behavior analysis, but I know something I found really valuable when designing my own program was using elements of general case analysis, which comes from direct instruction. And then also behavioral skills training. So this wasn't included in this chapter, but I know as I was working on my dissertation and talking with others in my lab who were working on similar projects, we really got talking of how BST involves a lot of the same components that we talk about in behavioral instruction. And then sometimes people separate out this CAPC, or computer-aided personalized system of instruction, so described by Joseph Pear and colleagues. I am a little hesitant to distinguish it as it's kind of its own method of behavioral instruction, or rather just kind of taking PSI, which was originally designed to be in these big paper manuals, and applying it with course management software. But you will find literature with that term CAPC, or computer-aided personalized system of instruction.
Mm-hmm. When I think of PSI, sort of Fred Keller describes it, and Goodbye Teacher, I'm thinking of like Apollo 13, or like all those folks with like the manuals. Like we gotta build a square peg for this round hole in the space capsule. It's just these giant binders and like lots of the dot matrix printer printouts, and like, well, the computer, it's over there. It can only do simple addition, and it takes up a whole room. But that's how we'll keep track of who's doing what. It feels both futuristic and very old-fashioned at the same time.
That's well put.
I'm not sure that's what it looked like, but
I don't know. There's a lot of, like you think of the manuals that they would use, there's a lot of like flipping back and forth. It'd be like you fill in the blanks, and then you flip to the back and check your answers, and then go back.
So there's some common elements to all of these, right? That sort of describe that this would fall under the umbrella of behavioral instruction rather than some other technology. Some of them seem pretty basic in terms of, the learner is always right being one, which, that kind of falls under a lot of categories, but there's some other ones a little bit more precise than that.
Absolutely. So as far as thinking of what are the common features of these different methodologies that we call behavioral instruction. So the one really important feature is contingency management. So looking at the contingencies for the different behaviors you're having the learner engage in. So that ranges everywhere from what are the immediate consequences for correct and incorrect responses. So whether that's correct or that's incorrect, or are you providing immediate feedback, or is the feedback a little bit delayed? How elaborate is the feedback? But then also contingencies surrounding other behaviors related to the program. So whether that's course completion. So as we'll talk about in my dissertation, we had contingencies around, okay, you take this probe, we call them check-ins, and if you get 90% or greater, then you can skip this unit and go to the next one. So making sure that you could kind of test out of a unit if you didn't need to experience that content.
Kendra, did you know that I did a PSI class in undergraduate? It was called Behavior, and I didn't even know it was PSI, and I thought my professor was just lazy. Because I didn't know what it was, and we had to earn the right to see him. So we worked at our own pace. I met with a TA, did the quizzes, and then if I did well enough on my quizzes, then I got to like advance to the next round and like meet with him.
That is a piece that I always thought was so interesting about that model. So did it make you actually want to see the professor more, or did you have like a counter-control response to it?
Yeah, no, not really, because I didn't know him.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say, but I think he was on his way out. He was like retiring. And I think he might have loved drinking a lot on the shift.
Glad I saved my workbook from 1964. I can just phone it in.
I did learn a lot in that class. This is the first time I was ever that I ever had any context with behavior analysis at all. But it would have been helpful if they would have explained what was happening, because I was like, this is the weirdest class I've ever taken. I don't even have to take it. And then I meet with this person I don't know, and I get to earn my professor. I mean, he was very smart.
So yeah, was one of the features of PSI was those like lectures only for motivational purposes. So the idea that the lectures were a reinforcer.
No, thank you, teacher. See you later.
The professor having like such a big ego. You're like, you can't wait to come hear me lecture.
No, I did the workbook. I'm great. I passed your class. I don't want to talk to you because I'm 19 and I have a lot of other things I could do with my time.
Exactly. So, I mean, that comes back to contingency management. I think when Keller originally designed it, maybe it seemed like a great idea, but in practice, if accessing your professor does not function as a reinforcer, then maybe we need to change up those contingencies a little bit. But contingency management is very big and covers feedback, completion contingencies, all that good stuff. Another really important component is this term component composite analysis. So taking a complex skill, breaking it down into its component parts. And I think Chase does a nice job in this, or Bernstein and Chase do a nice job in this chapter talking about how this is one area that sometimes is met with resistance from higher education administrators. Because if we look at it as, okay, well, we're focusing on these very simple behaviors. So like we'll talk about in the Mason article of something like SAFMEDS, where we're just filling in the blank of having a kind of very distinct, simple, quote, behavior. But higher education administrators are more concerned with these like higher order thinking type outcomes. But thinking from our perspective in behavior analysis, if we can understand more complex phenomena through the relation of different simple events. So I think as you're designing a program of behavioral instruction, a large part of that is taking the thing that you're teaching and really breaking it down into those component parts. And then another really important aspect is active responding. So a really high rate of active responding.
What's active responding, Kendra? Can you tell us?
That's a great question. It might take a lot of different forms. Bernstein and Chase talk about it as opportunities to practice the skills that the program of instruction or the program of behavioral instruction is seeking to teach the students to perform. So whether that is answering a multiple choice question or answering a fill in the blank question, or having a small group discussion. Maybe if you are doing something like SAFMEDS, doing a 1-minute timing. So the responses involved in active responding could be the responses involved in active responding are very wide, but the idea is that you're requiring the student to do something at a very frequent rate. So these last two components, kind of like you were saying, Rob, could be seen as something common to all of behavior analysis of focusing on measurable behavior and this idea that the learner is always right. But if you think about kind of traditional higher education arrangements, that's not always the case. So if we are measuring a skill like designing a functional analysis protocol, how are we measuring that? And then also this idea that the learner is always right. And if the learner isn't making progress, then we need to change something, whether that's the contingencies, the way that we're presenting instruction, maybe breaking the skill down into smaller component parts. But if you're teaching a semester-long class in a higher education setting and you have a student who's not being successful, well, we don't necessarily say, okay, well, we're gonna adjust the contingencies, or you know what, I'm gonna change my lesson plan or my approach. So I think that's another reason, perhaps, that behavioral instruction doesn't have a lot of traction currently in higher education.
I mean, unlike some of the sort of teaching methodologies that have a lot of good research behind them at the sort of elementary and secondary level, it does feel like while there are a lot of kind of data supporting the use of behavioral instructions, there are a lot of legitimate reasons that one might decide it's not for your class or for your institution. I mean, we sort of talked about the idea of the higher order thinking, you know, our skills that are focusing on breaking down complex skills into their component parts, really higher education, or is that something that should have been learned already? We can sort of debate whether that's a fair assessment at all times, whether that is an important component of learning the higher order thinking that might get missed. Sort of those professors that are like, you're just going to listen to me lecture for an hour and I'm going to blow your minds with my awesome thoughts. And that's going to get you ready for having your own research lab in the future, right? Are there any other reasons sort of that when you were looking into behavioral instruction that jumped out at you as those are legitimate reasons that behavioral instruction might not have the leverage that, we might think it should have based on, its illustrious history?
Absolutely. So it's funny you mentioned, Jackie, that you were saying like, oh, you thought your professor was lazy and that's why they were making you do PSI, whereas it is a ton of work to put together a program of behavioral instruction. We'll talk about with my dissertation, we easily spent over a year just developing the program. And especially kind of pre-technology when we didn't have Moodle or Canvas or Blackboard to grade our multiple choice quizzes for us, then the assessment part was also a lot of work. And even as we'll talk about when we're looking at some higher order responses like short answers or where I was asking participants to make graphs and then I had to score them, it's a lot of work. And I think that degree of preparation, because yes, it's maybe a little bit less effort once the course is kind of off and running, you have all your materials prepped, but faculty, as I'm sure you guys know, don't really have time for that in order to design that type of program that's really, really comprehensive. So
what am I paying for? Yeah. What are all these student loans for then, Kendra? I want my money back.
I don't know, man.
I demand a giant workbook.
There, yes.
Really,
so I think that's another big one. Yeah.
Yes.
Takes a lot of time.
These lazy college professors, I tell you. Right, guys? Right? You know what I'm talking about, right? No, you don't? No? I'm getting nasty looks. I'm getting some nasty looks over here. I wonder why. I know y'all work hard. It does seem like without the technology, I don't know how this lasted more than, Fred Keller taking 5 minutes and be like, I did one course that way and I don't want to write about this anymore because it took me forever just to make a class.
Yeah. And I think too, like it's helpful to have the Moodle or Canvas systems, but then like trying to instruct the computer on what needs to happen is like a whole separate skill set that's also pretty hard. Mm-hmm. So
absolutely. Or even just you think about like if you're preparing slides for a lecture, you have like an outline of what you're going to say, or you put up an image. But if you are creating something that a student's going to view completely asynchronously, and whether it's you're like making a video or writing out something that's like just literally, it takes more effort to create something that's going to operate asynchronously.
Well, Kendra, I know we want to talk about a little bit more sort of specific uses of behavioral instruction. But before we get to that, if you had unlimited time, unlimited resources, and you got the call from, whatever institution that you want to, like, Kendra, we need you. We need a behavioral instruction course. You have to. This is going to be the class by which all higher education goals for the next 50 years are judged. What would be kind of your dream class? Or more, I guess, what would be like the factors you're like, well, this would have to be a part of my instruction for me to say, I did all I could to sort of push the field of higher education instruction and behavioral instruction as far as it could go, within my lifetime? Like, what would be those pieces?
Wow. That's a big ask right there.
You do it for free as well, because it's a pilot program. They don't know if this is going to work, so it's all on your own time.
As far as like the skill that I would want to hone in on is, I would absolutely love if either someone would pay me, or maybe I'd do it for free to develop a program.
You probably would do it for free. You'd be like, this is very exciting.
Yes.
We asked a lot of other people too. They all wanted money, but they said, Kendra Guinness, I don't know. Maybe she'll do it for free, right?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
She loves this stuff. She's just doing it. It's
totally fine. Yes. Don't. I'm trying to get money from the NIH right now, guys. Don't let that get out. I think going back to like the foundational skills of college. So like I'm imagining like you enroll in college, and before you come for your orientation week, you log on to this platform and it's like, I'm going to walk you through. Yeah, this is a syllabus. This is where you find this information. This is a situation where maybe you should ask your professor for XYZ accommodation. I actually did a project for one of my classes in my doctoral program on interventions related to teaching college students with disabilities to request accommodations. And I thought that was really, really neat, because I think and something that I've kind of changed my perspective on as I've taught as an adjunct is, we get frustrated when we say, oh, well, it's in the syllabus. Why didn't they look in the syllabus? I've seen some great t-shirts of that's just it's in the syllabus. But recognizing that, especially maybe college students with disabilities or coming from diverse backgrounds, that might not be a skill that they've learned yet. And also even kind of the way disability services are structured in college, I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, is it's on the individual to request those accommodations. And that individual might have a disability that's limiting their skills related to requesting that accommodation. So I think if it was just a blanket, everybody gets this, and you could test out of it, absolutely. So you do your little pre-test and be like, I can write a professional email, I can find information in a syllabus, good to go. But students who maybe need some more practice with those skills would get it before they start their first semester of college. So I would definitely love to do that.
All right, that's got to be a component. I like that component. I think that's definitely reflected in your research article, which we'll be discussing shortly. That sense of not everyone needs all of the things that are instructed, but you need to have all that instruction available just in case, so everybody learns. That's all right. We lied. We are totally going to pay you for this class. We love that. The parents all said they don't want to pay anymore. They don't want any student loans, but that sold them on it. The fact that everyone gets to learn in your class, they like that idea. Okay, good. Well, let's take a quick break, and then when we get back, let's talk about the experience for one of the original behavioral instructions programs that you did put together, part of your research. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey everybody! Before we return to our discussion of behavioral instructions, I want to remind all of our listeners, ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in your podcast player show notes section to put in some key information, including 2 secret guest code words that you'll need to enter. The first one is Stormtrooper. STORMTROOPER, one word. There's a lot of stormtroopers in the world. The ones we were thinking of, the ones Dr. Guinness was thinking of, were the ones from Star Wars. We all love them, right? The bad guys that can't shoot very well. Remember? Stormtroopers, Anyway, that's our code word. And back to our discussion. And we are back talking with Dr. Kendra Guinness about behavioral instruction. So when we last left off, Kendra had put together an amazing pitch for what should be in a college class in terms of unlimited resources, unlimited funds. But let's talk about nitty-gritty of what it actually takes to put behavioral instruction into practice in this day and age. So you put together kind of a behavioral instruction, but some other package components to teach graph visualization, graph understanding, verbal behavior around graph. A lot of pieces.
Yes.
I was a little surprised that you wanted to have so many pieces, and I don't know if you were told you had to have them or you.
Oh no, it's funny because I was reflecting back on kind of how did we get here? It was so much a process of we'll teach graphing. And at first we started so broad. It's all right, well, first we'll teach them how to draw the graph by hand, and then we'll teach them how to enter the data, and then we'll teach them how to analyze the data. And then we're just whoa, this is way too much in order to teach it really, really comprehensively. And I think I I'm glad I did it, and I learned so much from this project. But yeah, it did get pretty complicated. But I
A lot
think
of appendices describing
a lot
all of the
appendices.
ways you broke down graphing. A few terms, even I was like, well, I don't know what the heck that term is. Yikes! I'm glad I wasn't in that class.
Oh, it was a fun one, and yeah, the development process was a lot of it. So actually, the paper's currently under review, but we actually split my dissertation up into 2 papers that were. So we have this one is the experimental one, but we have another one just about the development process. But yeah, so kind of getting down to what are all the components of a graph. We thought there's no way we're going to be able to cover visual analysis. So the way we kind of landed on this idea of graphing conventions is thinking about, I had always been someone who really enjoyed graphing, of tinkering around in Excel and later in GraphPad Prism. And I kind of gained a reputation for being hypercritical of graphs and was thinking of like all those little rules that we follow when we create graphs, whether it's the graph's got to be black and white, or your data path breaks at the condition line, or things like that. So that's ultimately what we decided to focus on. And the reason we included this verbal behavior component is we're kind of conceptualizing the skill of creating a graph that aligns with behavior analytic graphing conventions, kind of thinking about it as like a problem solving strategy. So if you're shown a graph and you're like, ooh, I know that this axis label is supposed to be parallel to the axis, but right now it's perpendicular, so I need to fix that. And when I was looking at the previous research on teaching graphing, which there was a lot of previous research, a lot of TAs, I'm looking at video modeling. But one thing that I particularly was kind of surprised at when I was looking at that literature is if you read the introductions of a lot of these studies, they're about graphing and graphs and why graphs are important, but not necessarily, oh, well, this is the best way to teach a complex computer-based skill to graduate students or behavior therapists or whoever it was. So I really wanted to break down like what is that complex chain of behavior that occurs when someone's sitting down at their computer, they've got Microsoft Excel open, and you get those ugly blue and orange lines and quote, you need to fix them. What is that whole process? So that's really what I wanted to target here.
I wonder why they chose blue and orange.
I know, right? It's weird.
Maybe it was a Florida grad.
They're like, go! Yeah!
Go Gators!
Did you like how I was like, I'm not sure what the blue and orange is, so I just said go, and I let
That's
you figure
okay.
it out.
That's all good. Yes.
So what were the pieces when you were thinking about, all right, we're doing something with behavioral instruction, we're doing graphs, doing graph creation or identifying parts of graphs. What were the pieces that you wanted to have as components, or was this based on sort of your favorite components of behavioral instruction, or ones that you just thought, I think these are the most doable for the technology at the time, for the participants I'm going to have?
So yeah, with Dr. Chase's guidance, kind of followed these components of behavioral instruction that they talked about in this chapter. So contingency management, component composite analysis, active responding, focusing on measurable behavior, and this idea that the learner is always right. So I realized the one I didn't talk as much about as a critical component is mastery criteria. So having some minimum competence that the learner has to demonstrate before they exit the program. So we knew that was going to be key, looking at the different types of feedback we would provide for different responses, but also having contingencies around completing the different learning activities. And then, of course, that component composite analysis of breaking down, these are the conventions that we're going to teach, and we're going to teach them individually. Mm-hmm. So not necessarily was like, all right, well, I'm going to take this from PI and this from PSI, but really just kind of thinking about it as a whole of what conceptually is going to be most effective. Mm.
Now, I gave you I complimented. I loved your choice of the chapter and suggesting we didn't have to read it all. I thought that was very kind of you. But here's the compliment sandwich. It's coming.
Oh boy,
in the middle part. This is a Rob reading research rejection on my part.
Nice.
I do not like this. You had 2 experiments in your one study. I don't like that. I think it's rude. It's rude to your reader. They're expected to read 1 study. They have to read 2. They didn't time that. I don't know what happened there. But you did get different results. But why would you do this? why did you have 2 experiments within the study? I'm curious. I'm sure there was some, there's either a very exciting reason or it's a very boring reason, I'm sure.
Rob bring this up every single time it happens. He's like, how dare they?
Yeah, no, it's very valid. And I guess first I'll say that this is a condensed version. In my dissertation, there were actually 4 split up as study 1, 2, 3, and 4.
We wouldn't have asked you to be on the show if you'd been like, here's one. It's got 4 studies. Nope, sorry. Cancel that guest.
Yeah, absolutely not. So part of this was kind of the nature of iterative design of behavioral instruction. And I think that's another kind of key component, maybe not of behavioral instruction, but just kind of instructional design, especially as we're kind of branching out to adjacent fields of we made a program and then we had to test it. And then we got some data, got some feedback from participants, and then we made some changes. So we actually did this. So I had 2 participants complete the program as like a pilot study, and we didn't include their data here because it was a very rough version of the program. Literally just trying to make sure like that we got the Moodle stuff to work and the automatic grading to work. So really, it's just the practical reason of, so I had my first 2 participants, Zola and Lily, and they completed their participation in the study around the same time. And then when they had finished their participation and we got some great feedback from them in our sociability assessment, also looking at their acquisition data. And then that's where we kind of got this idea of, well, what if we kind of switch around the program a little bit? And that's where we decided to present those checklists first, kind of have that be the least intrusive intervention. And that's what led to study 2. Mm-hmm. So it was a necessity, unfortunately, to have the multiple studies.
Okay, all right, I'll let it slide this time. You know? So when you put together the package, I was sort of, and again, it's easy to say, why didn't you just start with study 2 first when you're reading someone's article they've published? So please take it with the understanding that I get to see the whole thing when it was all done, all the work was finished. But I did think it was very. I thought it was you were really thinking through the challenge of teaching this skill by making sure to include those conceptual training modules first in study 1, because when I sort of looked at study 2 and kind of quickly looked at the graphs and the results, I was like, oh you probably seems like you would have do that. Here's a checklist, folks. Do your best. And then come back to the really complex, like look at all these multiple exemplars and adding the general case analysis around the verbal behavior and describing graphs. But so what was kind of the thought process in terms of like, was it more looking at the higher order skill, or were you considering the conceptual training modules the smaller chunks of skill that would lead to the more complex skill, or as a way to include the higher order sort of discussion and thinking of the concept? Like where did that kind of fall in your development of your protocol and your procedure?
I will thinking about when the development took place for this. I think the timing is critical. So I defended my dissertation proposal in the fall of 2019. And I began data collection for my dissertation in January 2020.
Yes.
Okay.
So we actually had originally conceived that this program was going to be embedded into the Introduction to Single Subject Design course at a university. And we had originally imagined it would go something like there would be periods of class time where it's like, all right, it's time to work on your graphing modules. And everyone would pull up their graphing modules, and you might be on different modules than the person next to you. But then we'd also have that contingency management piece of if you fly through all the modules and are done before the end of the semester, you can leave early. So we originally thought of this as this was going to be something to do in the context of a class, but have everybody kind of going at their own pace. COVID made us change our plans a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I think definitely looking back, if we had originally thought that this was going to be strictly all right, just one-on-one, absolutely. I think the checklist first makes total sense. And that's, I think, ultimately the thing we learned from this of, try, if we can do it with just a checklist, let's do it with just a checklist. But having that program of behavioral instruction available for the students who do need it.
That makes a lot more sense of how this all went together. Because study 1 felt very thorough, but in a way that, if the goal is just learn about the graphs, there's a lot of extra steps. Are all of these needed? And but when as a part of a larger class with multi-components, then this should all be included. This is all going to be relevant to the skill development of the student. So I'm glad I asked. Yes. And that you didn't just say, thanks, I spent a lot of time on this. Thanks so much for your rude question.
No, it's okay.
Why did I come up with a better hypothesis first, jerk? Thanks a lot. Thanks. So thank you for answering. It adds a lot of context.
I know. And I was very lucky that I was able to adjust pretty easily. Like I really didn't miss a beat as far as once the pandemic hit, and I was able to just continue doing data collection because I would meet with the participants via Zoom just to kind of be there if there were any technical issues, but they were ultimately doing everything on their own on their computer. So I know some of my lab mates and others in the program had to completely pivot what they were doing for their dissertation research. So definitely the timing is important to remember.
So next question is a little choose your own adventure. You can pick which one you want to answer. You can answer both if you really want to. But you can either give us a little bit of the nuts and bolts of just like the logistics behind how did you create this behavioral instruction sort of graph teaching or graph instruction package, or you can tell me, how do you put a freaking condition change line in Google Sheets? Because I saw that as something that you had students do. I've spent hours trying to make a stupid line in Google Sheets. It doesn't work. So I don't know what I'm missing. So you can pick which one you think the listeners, I mean, I know which one I want to hear, but maybe the listeners want to hear the other one.
I think I might go with the former just because I will say Google Sheets is terrible and I've only had to graph in it a handful of times. I don't recommend it, but there's a whole other menu you have to open to insert a drawing, and it's awful. So don't do it if you can. But I would love to chat about how we made this crazy program. It did involve me making over 400 graphs of hypothetical data.
Gross, and also exciting for you.
Oh God.
Yes, a little bit. And so also
session 1, session 2, 1, 2, 3, like real easy, right? Just a simple graph data point.
Oh yeah, definitely. But making sure it was varied across experimental designs and then also for each graph, then varying across the different conventions. So that's why I know we have a lot of appendices in this article, but just trying to show kind of what the participants saw on their screens. I think it's Appendix D shows kind of like the 3 graph array where it's like, not this, this is the convention. And they never saw the same graph twice. So that was another really important component.
Dedication.
Yeah.
So if you ever need a graph of hypothetical data, let me know. I've actually done that for some people. They're like, do you have like a changing criteria? And I'm like, gotcha. Yeah, got plenty of those. So that was part of it. And then also getting a lot of feedback. So my lab was really involved with this. I gave shout outs in my acknowledgement section to the other students in my lab of, well, what do you think about this? Or like, how does this look? And then as far as the verbal behavior piece, so the technology I used is based in Moodle. It's called Moodle Cloud. And it was available for free, which was awesome. So it's kind of the unaffiliated version of Moodle, whereas universities that have their own Moodle site. And I kind of basically just taught myself how to code in Moodle. So like there were certain ways with the short answer responses. Let's say the participant had to write something like the graph is black and white. We wanted the program to be able to provide feedback on that response automatically. So that involved partially thinking about what are all the possible things that the student could say that we would consider correct. And then things like the way that you can enter it into the program of using these things called wildcards. So it could be like, it doesn't matter if you say black first or white first, as long as you have black and white somewhere in there. So, and again, this was now 3-4 years ago, especially now when I'm hearing stuff about like Chat GPT and all that stuff. I think the sky's the limit as far as getting computers to do some of the legwork for us.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Kendra, I know we talked about the appendices and those are great visual representations, but could you sort of like run through like, all right, I'm sitting down to do my graph. What am I clicking on? What's in front of me? What's that feedback that I would get after? Or what does my checklist look like? I know there's a helpful hints section on the Moodle page, but just kind of what would I see? What would I do in part of my session?
Sounds good. So for setting up a session, so if it was a conceptual training module session, I would say like, all right, we're doing this. We're going to enter this module. And the first thing you would see, we called an initial frame. We use this term frame from some instructional design literature. I took a lot from Tiemann and Markle, have a lot of really great literature on this topic. Again, kind of behavior analysis adjacent. And so a frame is basically just a piece of information. So the initial frame said, the graph is black and white, if we're going to focus on that convention. And it showed the kind of image array that I have in Appendix D of, here's a graph that's not black and white. Here's a graph that's not black and white. It should look like this. Then the participant would click next. And there would be again, borrowing from Jack Michael's terminology, there would be a topography-based response opportunity. So it would be a new image, totally different graph. And the question would say, what convention does this show? And the participant had to type in, the graph is black and white. And if it was correct, they'd click next and it would say, yes, that's right. And they would move on. If it was incorrect, it would bring them back to the initial frame to repeat that process. After the topography-based response opportunity, we then had a selection-based response opportunity. So basically a multiple choice question. So a question saying, which graph shows the convention? The graph is black and white. Then an array of 3 graphs, again, graphs they had never seen before for them to choose from. And then that process repeated for the conventions within that unit. And so we had 3 units, each with between 11 to 14 conventions.
Mm-hmm. And they're all listed. I love the idea of thinking about learning graphs as the aesthetics section of. It's like I never think about the aesthetics of my graph, but I guess I must. But
I'd never thought of the term adding and removing visual ink from the graph.
It's a thing, yeah. Because like I said, we were working on. There's a whole separate paper on this process. But when we originally, I would have loved to just have here's a list of the graphing conventions for behavior analysts. It doesn't exist. Or where it does exist, there are about 6 or 7 of them, and none of them agree. So that was another, again, why we're writing a whole separate paper on it, of just identifying those types of things was a big part of this too.
So I know we kind of already talked a little bit about the results in terms of, for many of your participants, certainly in study 2, it did seem like having the checklist and feedback. For some of them, they were able to master some of the skills in the categories. For others, they weren't, and they did the kind of the conceptual sections. And then they were, over time, able to master the components of all 3 sections. Anything else kind of from the results that kind of jumped out at you, or that you thought kind of would have changed what an experiment 3 would have looked like, or if you were going to design something similar for, say, a different skill?
Another component we did in an experiment 2 is this, what we called a component composite analysis of, we visualized how behavior changed for 2 of our participants on the level of the individual skill. Mm-hmm. So our dependent variable was a percentage accuracy averaged across the number of conventions that were in the module, as we called them. But what we found is, so we did this for our participants, Alex and Ina, is some interesting response patterns. And this is something I'd love to explore further in future research, where for Alex, we found what I kind of called the checkerboard pattern of, when Alex wasn't demonstrating a skill, she might demonstrated it some of the time, but not all the time. So that's the image kind of looks like a checkerboard of, for example, there was something like the y-axis starts at 0. Is one of the conventions. And maybe she demonstrated on the first probe, but not the second probe, but then the third probe, but then not the fourth probe, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas Ina showed a much different pattern in that once she acquired a skill, she implemented it consistently. And we were trying to think about kind of what the implications might be. So whether it's, if you see that kind of consistent responding of the learner doesn't demonstrate the skill, and then they demonstrate the skill. Maybe that's showing truly a skill deficit. Sorry, I think my Bluetooth is confused. Whereas if we see that kind of checkerboard pattern of the skill is being demonstrated some of the time, but not all, maybe that is more an example of maybe a contingency management issue of, okay, they can do the skill, but maybe it's just not happening at the strength that we want it to. So that's something I definitely would love to explore more, because I think that has implications for maybe what the next step would be for those participants of, say, maybe the participant still isn't being successful even with the feedback checklist and the conceptual training modules. Kind of what would they need next might depend on that pattern of responding.
Kendra, were you able to pull all of that information from the Moodle data, or did it like print that out, or you had to pretty much go into Moodle and look at individual responses per the categories in your visual?
That's a good question. So these data that we analyzed were actually the data from the graphs that the participants actually constructed. So these were not scored on Moodle. So this was just they created an Excel document, they submitted it on Moodle. So that's how we received it. But this was scored, and got to give a shout out to Grace Echo Jojo, who helped with all of my IOA. This was scoring the graph according to a checklist.
Got it. And then that was how you kind of created the visual to look at look at those patterns. Mm-hmm. That would be so fascinating if you could get that same data through like Moodle self-scoring or something, or some program to sort of, churn out that data and then, use it as part of now you go on this path because you're clearly making error pattern A or B,
yes, right? That would be amazing.
Mm-hmm. I don't know how you do that, but
I don't know either. If someone can design that, that'd be great.
You mentioned ChatGPT. I'm sure I could do that.
Someone.
Easy. So easy. Just type it in. So, Kendra, after reading your study and sort of looking at the package you'd put together, the Mason 2017 study, or Mason et al. 2017 study, that seemed a lot simpler in terms of looking at behavioral instruction. It was like, man, I don't think people like tests and they don't like flashcards. I wonder if we tied these two together, if it would increase learning. Was that a study that you sort of just had as like another example of behavioral instruction, or was that an article that you'd been reading when you were getting ready that sort of informed your own practice?
That's a really good question. So as I was thinking about what would be another good article to include here, I think I did want to pick something in a little simpler and just another application of behavioral instruction. So a little bit simpler in that the dependent variable was they were just measuring the correct and incorrect responses on their SAFMEDs. But I think the quiz avoidance contingency is a really interesting component. And that gets at that part of behavioral instruction, of that contingency management. So in the study, at first, it was the students did their timings with their SAFMEDs, and then they also had to take a quiz. But in the intervention,
like fluency cards, right?
Yes.
If anyone's not familiar, I didn't even know what it stood for. But it's say all fast, 1 minute each day. Shuffle.
Yes. So it's funny you say, because I
never knew.
It must have been in the earlier versions of the course, because we did SAFMEDs when I took ABA 601 back in the day. It was something, but they're basically flashcards of maybe you'd have the term DRA on one side, and then you had to say differential reinforcement of alternative behavior on the other side.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. But SAFMEDs is based in precision teaching. So the working on building fluency, graphing your own performance, and also looking at rates of acceleration. So it was interesting to me in this study that I think what they were trying to do was increase the studying behavior of preparing for these SAFMEDs timings. And as they saw, again, it would probably be pretty difficult to measure studying behavior between classes. They kind of took this, okay, maybe if we just apply this simple contingency, that might have an effect. And it did. Of if you beat your previous day's SAFMED score, so you answer more of your flashcards correctly, fewer incorrectly, then you don't have to take the quiz that week. And we saw for all three participants kind of immediate increases in their accurate responses and decreases in their inaccurate responses.
Yeah. Quite beautiful, really.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So someone needs a thesis topic and wants to replicate, go for it. But so I thought it was interesting because they also, especially in their introduction, really kind of highlight a lot of the things they talk about in the Bernstein and Chase chapter of that higher education is thinking about these more complex, higher order thinking outcomes. But sometimes a side effect of that is less frequent assessment. And behavioral instruction is kind of built on this idea of really, really frequent assessment. Something I also really like about this article is they were attending to the social validity of their procedures, because one thing they were worried about is that the more frequent assessment was going to be aversive for their participants. So they kind of discussed multiple perspectives around that. Did the study demonstrate that quizzes were aversive because the students' behavior changed to avoid the quizzes? But at the same time, on the social validity assessment, the students rated the course as that they enjoyed it and that they felt they learned. So I think that's another big area for future research of kind of this idea of aversive control in higher education settings.
Mm-hmm. And one of the participants, they mentioned they didn't have a lot of data points because she was absent a lot.
Yes.
The question raised, is she absent because he's like, man, I hate both types of tests and I can not show up.
Yep.
I think I'd pick flashcards. If someone said you don't have to take the test, you just have to do the flashcards. I think just on its face, that does sound like, yeah, that sounds correct.
Yeah.
I think research will play out that hypothesis.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Which is one of the advantages of having like repeated opportunities to respond, particularly in a relatively low risk environment. There's some of that pressure's off. It's okay if you make a little mistake, but you have a lot of opportunities to make mistakes, right? And the test or even quiz like that can produce so much anxiety and stress for students. I think it can adversely affect performance as well.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Or the test you get when you're like, I don't think, like, we didn't learn any of this junk. Like, well, this is not a fair question.
Pick the best answer.
Yes. Yeah, those are rough. So, yeah.
Okay.
So another example of how behavioral instruction can be used. Well, I think with a nice big discussion and then some nice drilling down into some more recent examples of the literature on behavioral instruction, I think it's time for us to pull into the dissemination station. Oh, here we are. So this is the part of the show where we sort of talk about, kind of sum up what we learned today and to sort of talk about what behavioral instruction or what the topic could mean to practitioners or to folks interested in learning more. I kind of had two big questions, Kendra, in terms of the behavioral instruction. So for, not all of us are going to be, professors or providing, instruction at the higher education level. There's only so many higher education institutions.
Oh, yeah.
So it might not be for everyone. But if one were interested in that as kind of part of their career trajectory, what are some ways that you see kind of behavior analysts sort of improving the knowledge, the use, the adoption of behavioral instruction at a higher level? Or even what are the questions that we need answers to before we can even propose returning to some of the kind of the old, Keller, Skinnerian instructional models?
That's a really good question. I was going to say, and I'm so glad you asked, because one application that I'm really excited about, again, it wasn't in a research context, but just in a practical context. So one place clinic I was working at, I was designing some onboarding training for new hires. And previously thinking about how, okay, well, we got to read the employee handbook because there's a lot of things you got to know. You got to know like what time to show up in the morning and what's the dress code and how do you request time off and all those little annoying things that as a supervisor, you need people to know how to do them. So I designed a program of behavioral instruction essentially for the employee handbook. And part of our onboarding orientation week is we did some team building and some in-person trainings, but then we also had some, all right, go on your computer, you're going to do the communication module. And it's like, okay, who are you supposed to email if you're running late? Or what do you do if you want to switch shifts with someone or something like that? And literally walking them through step by step. So like frame one was like, you're expected to arrive at 8:15 in the morning. Next, what time are you expected to arrive in the morning? But then also doing some like assessments with questions that they had never seen before, whether it was like, does this outfit violate the dress code? So again, things that, but yes, it was a lot of work. I think I was able to do it relatively quickly because at that point, it was after I had completed my dissertation and I was very fluent on programming in Moodle.
I do have some bad news, everyone. I heard that low-rise jeans are back.
I know.
What? No.
Is that bad news or
I
just
love
news?
the high-waisted.
No, it's bad news.
That's bad news because then
Bad
we're going to
news
see
for the dress
so many
code.
butts.
And for me
So
personally.
many butts.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll have to incorporate then some negative exempt
right.
parts.
Yeah, exactly.
So as far as just about every single behavior analyst is going to be training somebody on something at some point. So maybe not to that extent, but definitely especially those things that are like, oh, why can't my team just remember to do this thing?
Yeah.
Think about some of these common components like contingency management and component composite analysis.
I love that.
That's great.
It's true too during those onboarding weeks that like face-to-face time is just so precious and you really want to spend it in the right ways,
Yes.
right? Including team building and building a culture for the new folks who are coming to you, and really reviewing critical components of how they need to interact with clients and parents and things like that are much harder to communicate via other asynchronous methods, right? But something like the handbook, chances are it would be virtually the same delivered by you or by you from the past.
Yes. Exactly. And I think that's really the beauty of behavioral instruction is and looking to the future, both in clinical settings or higher education settings, is can we have a little bit of both? So for those kind of nitty gritty, annoying things where it's like, all right, we just got to go over this. Behavioral instruction might be a good medium for that, of like, you can click through it, but it's also not just, okay, got to read this and sign something that you read it. Because honestly, who remembers things when they do that?
Right.
Versus I'm going to take you through it almost like a game of like, click, and then, okay, find the outfit that meets the dress code.
Yes.
But like I mentioned, that was done in a more clinical setting, but I got relatively good feedback from the employees who went through it. But I think definitely maybe exploring that more in research too, and seeing if there's strong social validity.
Oh, Kendra, that's fact. Yeah, I think you answered both questions. So good job.
Yeah. Yes.
You got it down to what? You took my feedback about 2 studies and one that you took it very nicely. You put it all in one. I appreciate that. Well, one thing that's been nice about doing the show for a super long time is that we finally upgraded our train that pulls us into dissemination station. So we have a food cart now. So let's add some pairings to our discussion before we disentrain. I don't know what you call it when you leave a train. Detrain.
Detrain.
Yeah,
Of course.
Like detrain.
Everyone, it's time for pairings, your favorite part of the show, in which I, Diana, tell you if you liked this episode's other episodes that you might also find relevant or interesting, as well as a snack that you could enjoy while you listen to them. So we've touched on this topic in a few different ways, a few different times. So it's a little bit of a smorgasbord, what I'm going to present to you now. But if you liked hearing about behavioral instruction, you could certainly, behavioral instruction specifically in higher ed, then you might also be interested in episode 55, in which we discuss interteaching with Dr. Jim Soldner, episode 113, in which we talk about visual inspection of data, episode 157, in which we discuss critical thinking in higher education with Dr. Darlene Crone-Todd, one of the original CAPC researchers. Episode 221, where we discuss behavioral instruction-based program for tracker training with Ryan Atkinson, also a Regis alum. And finally, recently, episode 230, where we attempted to discuss precision teaching.
That was the topic. Did we discuss it well? You be the judge.
And while you're enjoying those, I was like, what would be good for what would go well with PI? And I was like, of course, pie would go well with PI. So we're all having pie today. You know, there is a formula for pie. Well, both types of pie. There's a formula for pie, right? There's like a standard recipe, but then what gets put into it can vary from person to person. So I took my stab at deciding what everyone's favorite pie would be, but I'll be honest, Kendra, I did not know what your favorite pie was.
Do you know mine is?
She made a guess for you, Kendra. So
yes,
what's your
guess?
guess?
To tell you? Okay, yeah. I'll go in order. So, Jackie, I am delivering you a strawberry rhubarb.
You know me so well. I love you so much.
I love you too.
Wait, the twist was they were married the whole time on the show.
Rob, I am going to deliver you an apple pie.
I do like apple pie quite a bit.
Yes. But it's a little bit selfish of me because I'm delivering myself a pumpkin pie, and I think that's actually your favorite.
I think that might be. It's hard to say. It depends on the season. What's the top? Is it like a cookie crumble top on the apple pie?
It's getting
just
specific.
Standard.
My goodness. And then Kendra, I was like, well, she might actually like one of those three the most too. But then I took a turn and I said, no, she likes chocolate. So I was going to prepare you a French silk.
Mm.
I like it.
Yeah? Is there one, though, that is your actual favorite?
When it comes to pie, I don't know. There are a lot of pies I like. It's usually not my go-to dessert, though. Like if I'm going to go for a dessert,
you could just eat the middle.
I probably would, yeah. I did make a strawberry pie for Pie Day this year.
Very nice.
It was yummy.
If you put rhubarb in it would be my favorite.
Yeah.
Over like a pie pastry crust.
I like a graham cracker. Graham cracker's good.
So I also like key lime pie. That's probably my favorite.
Well, that's a good
Top choice. All right. Well, there you go. Please, everyone, go enjoy some pairings and some pie.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of the show. Dr. Kendra Guinness, thank you so much for being on with us and talking all about behavioral instruction and ideas for folks not just in higher ed, but who need to ever present information that may not be fun to do through video. There are some more effective ways that could be used. If folks want to reach out to either ask you more about behavioral instruction or to dig into your repository of fake graphs for use in whatever way they might think of, is there a way that they could do that?
Those are TM'd.
Yes, absolutely. Please feel free if you want to use my Regis email. It's Kendra.Guinness, 2 N's, 2 S's, just like the beer, at regiscollege.edu.
Oh, we're going to have beer with our pie, too.
Oh, awesome.
I should have said.
Ooh, beer pie. That sounds good.
Guinness and pie.
Yes.
Thanks once again to Dr. Kendra Guinness for being on the show and sharing so much about the ins and outs of behavioral instruction, as well as so much detail and needed context. You can't put it in the article, folks, but needed context to her study. It's a very fascinating talk, and she was very candid with all of her great answers in sort of how to develop such a complex piece of research design. We want to also thank a lot of other people, including you, the listeners. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you liked ABA Inside Track, and we'd love it if you subscribed to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us in a lot of other places online. We're on all the socials as ABA Inside Track. You can find us at our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of our previous episodes, links to articles that are discussed, and to purchase CEs. Speaking of purchasing CEs, you probably want that second secret code word. It is Moose. Moose. It's a giant creature with big antlers, relatively harmless, but you don't want to hit one with your car because your car will be destroyed and the moose will wander away, not caring. They're big things, folks. Moose. A couple other places that you can find the show. You can find our episodes posting on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can also get even more ABA Inside Track on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for $5 a month, you can get access to every episode a week ahead of time, a chance to vote on our book club super long episodes, as well as our quarterly live episodes, and a chance to get a free CE for attending or watching the videos of these free live episodes. We have another one coming up. I think at the time of this recording, we may have already done it or so, but you could still catch the video or still catch. It's a little bit special this season, this spring season, because we're doing one for Regis College at Regis College for our Babbitt group, which is one of our local behavior analytic or behavior analysis groups. So again, you can find that there, as well as access to our super long $10 subscribers get that super long book club, quarterly book club discussions, and 2 additional CEs for no charge as a thank you for subscribing and supporting us. We just should have released our latest book club, Calling Bullshit, looking at data skeptically in our data-driven world, or increasingly data-driven world. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Some final thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music. Big thanks once again to Dr. Kendra Guinness, and of course, big thanks to Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!